So in life, sometimes you're at home, right? And somebody comes to the door. You guys ever experienced this? You don't know necessarily who it is, but you hear a knock on the door. We'll go ahead and go to that next slide. Yep. So you hear a knock on the door, and now you have a question you have to answer, right? Am I going to open the door or not? Because I don't know who's at the door. And the person at the door, I may or may not want to let in. There might be somebody trying to sell me windows or a new roof, or like bug repellent, or all the other things they try to sell you when you just buy a house. Or it might be somebody that you really want to see. So what do? Well, you're going to have to open the door. Now, if you open the door and see this person, are you going to let them into your house? Probably not. They look like they're up to no good. But if you open the door and see this person, yeah, Grandma with pie, come on in, right? Because who doesn't like Grandma's pie? Now, if you open the door and you see these guys, some of you are like, yeah, absolutely, I want them to come in. I'm going to have a conversation with these guys. And some of you are like, no, I don't think so, because I might not be able to get them to leave. But if you open the door and see these guys, Girl Scouts with cookies. Do you guys have Girl Scout cookies out here? Okay, all right, because you were not as excited as I thought you would be about Girl Scout cookies. If you see Girl Scout cookies, like, yes, please, I will buy many of these. Now, I was going to be done with this illustration right here, but my wife convinced me there was one more I had to show you. If you open the door and it's this guy, I mean, some of you are like, yeah, I'd let him in. And some of you are like, okay, I'm not going to sleep for 3 days. This is terrible. Here's the reality. Our minds are like our houses. We can't control every person who comes to our house, right? And we can't control every person who knocks on the door of our house, but we can certainly control who gets in. And our minds are the same way. You cannot control every thought that comes knocking, but you can control what you let in. This is the truth that Paul is teaching us throughout the entire book of Philippians. Is that you can't control every thought that comes knocking, but you can control the ones that you let in. Well, when you think about how you think about things, right? So think about how you think about things. Usually we notice lots of things. In fact, scientists say that we have somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot. You notice a lot of things. You notice things that you see, things that you hear, things that you taste, things that you touch. So we notice a lot of things. But most of the things we notice, we just kind of let go. A few things, though, we actually stop and study. Like maybe if you experience this at a restaurant. You're sitting there, you've ordered your food, you're pretty excited about it, you're going to get a cheeseburger, you're really happy about that. And then the server walks by your table with someone else's dish. And they bring it to the table next to you, and you look at it, and you say, oh, that looks good. Is that salmon? It's grilled? Oh, man, that looks, and those potatoes, they look amazing. Now, you've not just noticed the other person's plate at this point, you're studying it, right? And you're looking at it, you're like, oh, that, and now you're starting to have regret. I ordered the wrong thing. And not only are you going to notice and study their plate, now you're going to replay it in your mind. The rest of the dinner. I wish I'd gotten that. This cheeseburger's not at all what I wanted. I wanted salmon, and I can't believe I didn't order salmon. I'm such a fool, and now I'm going to begin rethinking all of my life choices because obviously I have no wisdom. This is what we do sometimes. We notice, we study, and then we begin to replay. Now sometimes this can be good, right? If I'm in college and I'm taking Shakespeare, which I did, unfortunately in Shakespeare I noticed the stuff in the place. That was about it. I didn't study, I certainly didn't replay, and I just barely passed. But what I should have done is I should have noticed, I should have studied, and I should have replayed, because that way I really begin to know the material. I make it a part of me. We see a story on the negative of this in the Old Testament with King David, right? King David's out on his roof. He should have been at war with his men, but he's not. And he's surveying his kingdom. And he sees down the hill this woman, Bathsheba, behind her house having a bath. He notices. And in this moment, he has a choice, right? He's noticed, and he knows this is something that he shouldn't continue to look at, but instead he studies. He's like, oh, she's kind of pretty. And then he begins to replay. And eventually he says, I want her, bring her to me. And he commits adultery with her, and the consequences are far-reaching because he noticed, he studied, and he replayed. So what Paul is trying to teach us in Philippians is this idea of there are things in life that you notice, and that should be it. But there are some good things in life that you should study. And there are even some better things in life that you should replay. That's why at the end of Philippians 4:8, Paul says, think on these things. What are the things that he says you should think on? Well, he gives us a whole list. But when he says think, he's actually here talking not about noticing, not even about studying, but he's talking about replaying, because the way that he uses the word is this idea of that you think about something once and then you keep on thinking about it, and you keep on thinking about it, and you keep on thinking about it. So look at Philippians 4:8 with me. If you have your Bibles, you can open them there. We'll put it up on the screen. Paul writes, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think, replay, keep thinking about these things. Now, Paul begins with the word finally, because he's almost to the end of this letter that he's writing. He's writing this letter to the Philippians. He's in chapter 4. It's the last chapter. He's almost to the end. And so as he gives them this last little piece of advice, he wants them to remember where they've been. Now, it's been a while since we've been in Philippians, so quick review. Philippians chapter 1 is about our perspective. Right? Remember, Paul talks about his perspective. He talks about this idea that I have confidence that God will finish everything that he starts, and that drives how I think about things. He talks about some of the difficulties that he's experienced. He's in prison. There have been people who have been out to get him. He's not sure he wants to go on living because he's got health issues. But he says, but you know what? What's important is that I keep going for your sake. So Paul has this perspective that no matter what bad is happening, I trust God because God always finishes what he starts. Chapter 1 is about perspective. Chapter 2 is about other people. He begins by saying, I want you guys to get along, right? To agree with each other. And he says the secret to that is to have the mindset of Jesus, who is willing to humble himself, who is willing to sacrifice himself so that he could serve us. And then at the end of chapter 2, he talks about his friends Timothy and Epaphroditus, who have done this, who have served, who have sacrificed themselves just like Jesus did. Chapter 3 is about perseverance. He encourages the believers in Philippi to keep going, to press on in their faith, to not be distracted, not by false teachers, not by the distractions of life, not by difficult situations, but to keep going. And then he gets to chapter 4, and chapter 4 is all about peace. He begins by talking about these two women who are feuding, and he says, can you guys work with Euodia and Syntyche so that they can live at peace? And then he says, I want you as Christians to rejoice always, to be anxious for nothing, so that the peace of God will fill your lives. And that brings us here to verse 8, where he says, finally. And I might suggest that when he says finally, we can also just look at this as the last couple things he's talked about. That what he's actually saying here is that when you're in conflict, like Euodia and Syntyche, the remedy for conflict is to think on these things. In the next verse, he says, rejoice in all things. And sometimes it's hard to rejoice because we're discouraged. And what Paul is saying is the remedy for discouragement is to think on these things. And then he says, be anxious for nothing. And what he's saying here is the remedy for anxiety is to think on these things. Because let's be honest, this is not our default mode. Right? In this world, naturally, we do not default towards what is true, towards what is honorable, towards what is just, towards what is pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, praiseworthy. In fact, oftentimes it's the exact opposite. Our default is towards what is wrong. Right? What is wrong with what's happening? What is wrong with those people? What is wrong with me? What might go wrong? We love to think about that. And then that shifts into what am I upset about? What am I frustrated about? What am I hurt by? What am I afraid of? And of course, the world feeds this, right? I was a journalism major for a little while in college, and one of the things they taught us was if it bleeds, it leads. Because the understanding is in the media that we want to give bad news first, because bad news gets ratings. Conflict creates clicks. And so the world feeds us this steady diet of what's wrong, what's frustrating, what you should be afraid of. And what Paul is saying, actually, it's the exact opposite. Don't default towards these things. Instead of thinking about what's wrong, what might be wrong, what could go wrong, who's wrong, think about what is true, what is honorable, what is just, what is pure, what is lovely, what is commendable, what is excellent, and what is praiseworthy. Because when you think on these things, it becomes the remedy for conflict, the remedy for discouragement, and the remedy for anxiety. See, Paul, again, is reminding us that we can't control what comes into our lives. Sometimes conflict comes into our lives, doesn't it? What do we do then? Sometimes discouragement comes into our lives. Can we all acknowledge that we don't always feel like rejoicing? Like there are moments when you don't feel like rejoicing. And yet Paul says, rejoice always. And there are moments when I feel anxious. And yet Paul says, be anxious for nothing. What's he saying? He's saying, look, you can't control every thought that comes knocking. But you can decide what you let in. And the reality is that some thoughts deserve to be shown the door instead of offered a chair. But what we do so often is the wrong thoughts we invite in and say, I want to study this for a while. I want to keep replaying this in my mind. And so as we work our way through this list this morning, let's look at it in two ways. First, let's see this as a filter for what I should think about. When I think about the thoughts that come knocking on my door, how do I decide what gets in and what doesn't get in? This is kind of like a strainer. When you cook the spaghetti, you dump it out, the water goes through, the spaghetti stays. We want the good stuff to stay and the bad stuff to go. This is our filter. What do I keep thinking about? What do I study? Well, I study what's true. I study what's honorable. I study what's just. I study what's pure. I study what's lovely. I study what's commendable. I study what's excellent. I study what's praiseworthy. What do I replay? I replay all of those things. So we're going to think about this first as a filter for how we think. Secondly, though, we're going to think about this as a list of what we look for in the hard times of life. So in those times when I find myself in conflict, what do I look for? In those times of discouragement, when I don't feel like rejoicing, what do I look for? In those times of anxiety, when I'm not sure what's going to happen next, what do I look for? Well, in this moment, in this situation, I look for what is true. What does that mean? Well, it means that when I'm in conflict with somebody, I actually ask myself, am I seeing this situation truly? Or am I making assumptions? Am I drawing conclusions? Do I know the whole story? Do I know the complete story? Am I actually thinking about what is objectively true here? Or am I just looking for what I want to know? What is true? In this moment, in this situation, what is honorable? So whether it's a difficult situation my way or something I'm thinking about, one of the questions I ask myself is, does this thought honor God? Because, oftentimes, especially in those times of discouragement and anxiety, my thoughts don't honor God, they forget him. Like, I completely blank him out of the picture. And I start to think about, well, how do I fix this? How do I change this? What can I do about this? And I forget that I'm not the one in control. He is. So do my thoughts, do my responses honor him as the Lord, the Creator, the one who is in control? In this moment, in this situation, what is just? Justice is seeing things from all sides. So when I'm in conflict, am I choosing to see this from my opponent's side? When I'm struggling, when I'm discouraged, am I really seeing the whole picture here? Is it just? In this moment, what is pure? Now, oftentimes, purity goes all the way to our intentions, right? Am I doing this for the right reasons? Maybe a good way to think about the purity question is to say, would you want your grandparents to know what you're thinking right now? Would you want to tell your grandparents what you're thinking right now? What about your pastor? What about the Pope? What about Mother Teresa? If it's pure, you're going to want to tell the right people. What is lovely? This is so hard sometimes when you're in those dark moments of life to see what's good, isn't it? And all you can see is what's ugly. All you can see is what's bad. All you can see is what's disappointing. And yet even in those dark, dreary, devastating, discouraging moments, there is still good and there is still beauty because God is still in control. And am I looking for what is lovely? In this moment, am I looking for what is commendable? Think about it this way. Who would commend me on what I'm thinking right now? Who would say to me, yeah, that's a good thing to be thinking about? Because I don't necessarily want everyone to be commending me. If the person who is a serial complainer is commending me for my thoughts, that might mean these are the wrong thoughts. But if the person who's always talking and thinking about Jesus is commending me for those thoughts, that's what I want to be commended by. Well, how about this? Would Jesus commend me for the thoughts I'm thinking right now? Would Jesus commend me for the way that I'm responding to this right now? Would Jesus commend me for what I'm studying and replaying in my mind right now? Now, if you're looking at the passage, you'll see that after these first 6, Paul changes the way he writes. He says whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. And then he changes and he says, if there is anything excellent. Because I think what Paul is doing now is he's giving us these last 2 in the list. These are the summaries. And he's saying, is there anything excellent? These are the excellent things, actually. So this is the only place in all of Paul's letters where he uses this word. And this word was a very common word in Paul's time. This is a very common word in ancient Greece. Homer used this word a lot. Plato used this word a lot. Aristotle used this word a lot. The world loved to say, this is what is excellent. And I think what Paul is doing here is he's actually borrowing a concept from the world and saying, actually, all those things that the world is telling you are excellent, those aren't the things that are excellent. This is what is excellent. What is excellent is what is true. What is excellent is what is honorable. What is excellent is what's just. What is excellent is what's pure. What is excellent is what's lovely. What is excellent is what's commendable. If there is anything excellent, and if there is anything worthy of praise. Again, is this the kind of thing that brings praise to God? And is this the kind of thing that Jesus would praise? If so, he says, think on these things. Now, there's one other way for us to understand this list, and I think this is maybe the most helpful of all. Is I think this list is a description of Jesus. Think about it. Jesus is true. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is honorable. No one is to be honored more than him. Jesus is the ultimate judge. He is just. Jesus is pure. No one has ever lived who is more pure than him. He is the spotless Lamb of God. Jesus is lovely. He is everything that is good. Jesus is commendable. He is the only one who is really worthy of being commended. Jesus is the standard of excellence. Jesus is praiseworthy. See, this is what Paul is doing here for us. Is he's pointing us to the fact that Jesus is all of these things. And so to think on these things is not just to think random thoughts, but it is to think about Jesus. And understand this, while Jesus may be all of these things, the cross is the opposite of these things. Because Jesus went to the cross because of lies. The cross was a sign of dishonor. You're a criminal. Jesus hanging on the cross was anything but just. It was the most unjust thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. Certainly it was not pure. Certainly it was not lovely. Certainly those who put Jesus on the cross were not commendable. The cross is everything that this list is not, which is a reminder that Jesus has seen the darkness of this world. Jesus understands conflict. Jesus understands discouragement. Jesus understands anxiety. You see, sometimes our thinking is cross thinking instead of resurrection thinking. We don't get past the cross. So when Euodia and Syntyche are feuding with one another and unwilling to come together and live at peace, they're cross thinking. They're not thinking about what is true or honorable or just. When I find myself in those times of discouragement and I choose to not rejoice, to not be grateful to God, I'm choosing to think cross thoughts because I'm seeing the bad. I'm seeing what's not lovely. I'm seeing what's not commendable about life. When I allow myself to be overwhelmed by anxiety and I don't turn to Jesus, I'm thinking cross thoughts. And here's the thing. We like the cross. The cross is important to us, but we don't end at the cross. The cross is everything bad, and resurrection is everything good. And Paul is challenging us here not to have cross mindsets, but to have resurrection mindsets. Get past the bad, get past the false, get past the ugly, and focus on what is true and honorable and just and pure and lovely and commendable. And understand, this is not just Paul saying, hey, I've got an idea. You guys should try this. This is Paul saying, I have lived this, and I want you to imitate me. Look at the next verse, verse 9. It says, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So what is it that the Philippians had learned and received and heard and seen in Paul? Well, if you go all the way back to Paul's first relationship with the Philippian church, he came to Philippi. He started a church there. People were getting saved. One girl in particular who was part of the idol worship industry in Philippi got saved, and that cost the idol makers a lot of money. And because they had lost a lot of money, they brought Paul to court. And Paul was unjustly put on trial. And he was beaten and he was imprisoned. Look at Acts chapter 16. Acts 16, this is what happened to Paul. When they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. What's happening to Paul and his friend Silas is not true. It's not honorable. It's not just. And how do we generally respond when this happens to us? We complain, we get angry, we might be fearful, we get discouraged, we get anxious. What did Paul and Silas do? Look at the next verse, verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. I love this. They're grasping onto the truth that they know, that even though their situation is bad, God is in control, and they're still worshiping him. They're still honoring him. And as a result, the other prisoners are hearing them. What they're doing is commendable. And of course, you know the rest of the story. An earthquake comes, the jailer gets saved, and eventually they make their way out. But when Paul says to the Philippians in Philippians 4:9, hey, what you've seen and heard and learned from me, I want you to do this. He's talking about this. They all know this story. Hey, remember that time when Paul got thrown in prison? And instead of complaining, he sang and prayed? That's our example. Of course, that's not the only example, right? Paul is writing them this letter from prison. And even though he's writing from prison, remember what he said in Philippians 1:12. He said, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, being put in prison, sitting on death row, has really served to advance the gospel. Again, Paul didn't choose his circumstances, but he chose his response. Even though I'm in prison and things are bad, it's not what I want, I'm choosing to see that God is doing something really good here. So when he says to the Philippians, what you have seen and heard and learned from me, this is what he's talking about. Later on in chapter 1, he says the former, this is verse 17, the former proclaimed Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. So there are people who are being false teachers of the gospel, seeking to do harm to Paul and his reputation. And he says, what then? What should I do? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So in 4:7, when he says rejoice always, he's got the chops to say that. Because he's the one who, when people have gone after him, when people have talked badly about him, when people have attacked him, he's rejoiced in it because he said, I know that God is doing something good in all of this. So back to verse 9. Paul says, what you have learned and received and heard from me. They'd seen it in him. They knew his lifestyle. He says, practice these things. Now, I love what Paul's done here. Verse 8, he says, think on these things. Verse 9, he says, practice these things. This is a reminder to us, first of all, that Christianity is not an academic exercise. It's not something that only happens out here. It's something that we live out. We think and we live. We think and we practice. But secondly, what Paul is pointing out is that what we think impacts what we do. How I think about things impacts the way that I live. What I fill my mind with will ultimately fill my life. And so Paul says, practice these things. And then he finishes by saying this, and the God of peace will be with you. Now, just a couple verses ago, he said, and the peace of God will be with you. But he changes it here. Because what he's talking about now is not just this idea of peace and this feeling of peace and this sense of peace. He's actually saying God, who is defined by peace, will be with you. He's talking about the presence of God. This is not a conditional promise. Right? This is not Paul saying, if you do these things, then God will be with you. That's not what he's saying here. This is a motivational promise. He's saying God is with you, so do these things. The God of peace is with you. If you have Jesus, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. If you have Jesus, then you have the Holy Spirit, the Counselor of Peace. And the Holy Spirit connects you to God, the God of peace. You have the presence of God in your life. And the problem is we forget this. And our thinking reflects that we forget this sometimes. Sometimes I forget that the God of peace is with me. He's on my side. And in those moments when I lose this, I stop to focus on what is true and honorable and just. And I start to believe some of the lies from the evil one. And so Paul says, think on these things because God is with you. Now understand. The goal here is not to simply think better thoughts, right? The goal here is to think more about Jesus. Because Jesus reminds us that the God of peace is with us. I want to emphasize this again. What we are not talking about here is the power of positive thinking. That's not what Paul is teaching, right? Because the power of positive thinking says everything is good, right? It's like the Lego movie, everything is awesome. But we can be honest and say everything's not awesome. This world is messed up. There are things that are wrong. There are things that are broken. There is conflict. There is discouragement. There is anxiety. We're not ignoring that. The power of positive thinking says everything is good. Biblical thinking says everything is not awful. The world wants to tell us that things are awful. The evil one wants to tell us that things are awful. But when we stop and consider what is true, when we stop and consider what is honorable, what is just, what is pure, what is lovely, what is commendable, what is excellent, what is praiseworthy, we are reminded that there may be some hard things, but everything is not awful. You see, the cross is a picture of everything that is wrong. But the cross does not teach us to ignore that. The cross teaches us that what is wrong doesn't have the final say, because the cross leads to resurrection. So I don't need to focus on the lies, what is dishonorable, what is unjust, what is impure. I can focus on the resurrection. You see, the power of positive thinking says, I can change the world with my thoughts. You cannot. Okay? If you could, then we would have cheeseburgers waiting outside when we're done here because I'm really hungry right now. And I'm going to try to think them into, you can't do that. This idea that you can change the world with your thoughts is not true. But what biblical thinking says is that if I rely on God's truth, it will change the way I think about the world. I will not only see the bad, I will see the good. I will not only see what's broken, I will see what's being fixed. I will not only see what's unjust, I will see the one who is just. I will see Jesus. So, whatever is true, whatever is just, whatever is honorable, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is anything excellent, if there is anything worthy of praise, think on these things, because the God of peace is with you. Let's pray. Father, help us to think about you. Help us to realize that in a world where not everything is great, you are. In a world where much is broken, you are the healer. Father, help us to train our minds to be focused on you, to be focused on your Son. Help us to be Christ-centered in our thinking. Father, help us to be focused on all that you have given us, all that you have promised us, and all that you will do for us. In your name, amen.